Welcome to another deep dive, and this one is going to take us down a pretty dark path. We're going to be digging into the story of H. Holmes, one of America's first, recognized serial killers. We've got two main sources we're going to be looking at today, excerpts from his Wikipedia page, and then also a biography.com article. And we're going to try to, unpack what made this guy tick,
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure.
He confessed to 27 murders, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
Some people think that the real number is much, much higher.
Oh, yeah.
Possibly even 200.
200 is the number that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of exemplifies, this is a guy who operated in the shadows. We don't have, the benefit of modern forensics. And a lot of the evidence is, from over a century ago.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with, half the pieces missing. So, we've got this mystery on our hands, right? You've got this murder castle, which we'll talk about. Insurance scams. A personality that seems to just, go back and forth between charming and absolutely chilling. I don't even know where to begin with this guy.
Well, I think the best place to start is with the man himself. H. Holmes, which most people don't know, that wasn't even his real name.
Okay, wait a minute, hold on. What was his real name?
So he was born Herman Webster Mudgett.
Herman Webster Mudgett, okay.
Yeah. And the name change, right. Probably not for dramatic effect. It was to avoid detection from his previous scams and fraud that he was already involved in.
So he was already running from something.
Oh, yeah.
At a very early age, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. He was a con man through and through. I mean, from very early on.
And he even used other aliases too, right?
Oh, yeah. So he used Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and H.M. Howard.
So he really liked to play with, identities, huh?
He was a master manipulator.
Yeah.
And he had to keep, kind of reinventing himself to stay one step ahead of the law.
So, all right, we've got this guy. Herman Webster Mudgett, a.k.a. H. Holmes, a master of disguise already. What about his early life?
Yeah.
I mean, did anything, hint at this darkness that was to come?
On the surface, his childhood seemed pretty normal. He came from a well-to-do family. He was intelligent. But there were these glimpses into his psyche that were pretty unsettling.
Like what?
Well, for one, he had this morbid fascination with surgery. Even as a child, he would practice, surgery on animals. And there's this story, it may be apocryphal, but it's about a possible connection to the death of a childhood friend.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, take that for what it's worth.
That's a pretty big red flag, right? Those horror movies where you see the villain as a kid, he's pulling the wings off of flies?
Yeah, yeah.
It's oh, okay, here we go.
It's a classic trope for a reason, right?
Okay.
I mean, it speaks to this this fascination with death and pain.
Right, so he's already got that in him.
That's there.
But also, he's already running these scams and committing fraud as a young man.
Right, so there's this pattern of manipulative behavior that's pretty deeply ingrained from a young age.
So he's already comfortable, bending the rules,
right,
exploiting other people for his own gain.
Absolutely.
Which, that in itself, not a good sign. But it definitely could escalate, given the right circumstances.
Right, and it did.
Where does this twisted tale take us next?
Well, Holmes decides to pursue a medical degree.
Oh, boy.
At the University of Michigan.
You're telling me medical school didn't, curb this dark side?
No, it did not. In fact, it may have even exacerbated it.
Okay, how so?
Well, while he was studying medicine, Holmes began stealing corpses.
Stealing corpses? What for?
It was a two-pronged scheme. He would use the bodies for insurance fraud, collecting payouts on these policies he'd taken out on fictitious individuals.
That's so cold-blooded.
It is.
But, we already know he's a con man, right?
Right.
But this takes it to a whole nother level.
It does, but it gets even creepier. Because there's another possible reason he was stealing these bodies. Anatomical experimentation.
Okay.
So imagine, right? You've got this young medical student. He's already got this kind of morbid fascination. He's surrounded by bodies. He's learning the intricacies of human anatomy. It's like something out of a Gothic horror novel.
It's a little too creepy for me, but it does make you wonder if he was experimenting with ways to dispose of bodies.
Yeah.
Honing his skills for what was to come.
It's a chilling thought, and I think it really underscores a crucial point here, which is Holmes's medical training, it didn't just give him knowledge, it gave him power. The power to manipulate, to control, and ultimately to end life with a chilling degree of expertise.
And we're about to see how he uses that power in some truly horrific ways.
Yeah.
Now we have to talk about the infamous murder castle.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you can't really talk about H.H. Holmes without mentioning this House of Horrors.
No, it's central to his story. And it wasn't just a place where he committed crimes. It was a creation of his own twisted imagination.
So tell me, what was the deal with this place?
Well, leading up to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Holmes decided to capitalize on the influx of visitors. He constructed this massive three-story building in the Inglewood neighborhood, and on the surface it seemed like an ordinary hotel.
Right.
But underneath this veneer of normalcy, it was a labyrinth of secret rooms, hidden passages, and deadly traps.
Okay, so not your average bed and breakfast. What was the layout like? Was it really as elaborate and as terrifying as they say?
Well, it was definitely designed for a sinister purpose. So the upper floors, they had living quarters, but they were interspersed with these soundproof rooms and killing chambers. And each one was equipped with gas lines and trapdoors that led down to the basement.
Oh my God, he was like dropping his victims into the depths of this building.
He was.
That's horrifying. And what about the basement?
The basement was the real heart of his operation. It had a dissecting table, surgical tools, acid vats, even a crematory.
Hold on a second. I've also read that some of that stuff, like the torture chambers and the acid vats, are kind of exaggerations. Like they're myths that were spread by the press at the time.
Right. You're right. The murder castle has become this kind of legend, and it's been embellished over the years. So while it definitely had hidden rooms and passages, there's no evidence to support some of the more outlandish claims.
Okay, so we should be wary of the sensationalism.
But I mean, even without the embellishments, the reality of this murder castle is horrifying.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just the fact that he built this place with such a specific purpose in mind, it speaks to a level of premeditation and cold-heartedness that's just unfathomable.
It really is. It's like, what kind of person could not only conceive of a place like this, but then actually go through with building it?
Right. And it raises questions about, what motivates someone to do something like that. It's like he created his own twisted playground, where he had complete control over life and death. Speaking of victims, who were these unfortunate souls that crossed paths with H.H. Holmes?
He often preyed on, the vulnerable, often young women who came to Chicago seeking opportunity, maybe a taste of the excitement of the World's Fair. And he would use his charm, false promises of marriage or even employment at his hotel to lure them into his web.
It's just so chilling to think that he was like exploiting their hopes and dreams, turning their aspirations into a nightmare, basically. Now, I know the sources mentioned a few of the victims by name. Can you tell us more about some of them? Because I think it's important to remember that behind the statistics, these were real people with lives, with families, with loved ones.
Of course, of course. There was Julia Smythe and her young daughter Pearl. They were drawn in by Holmes's promises of a better life. He claimed to be smitten with Julia and offered them a place to stay at his hotel. Sadly, they were never seen alive again.
That's heartbreaking. I mean, a mother and daughter meeting such a tragic end. What about Emmeline Sigrand? I remember reading that her disappearance was one of the key turning points in the investigation.
Right, so Emmeline was a bright, ambitious young woman who worked as Holmes's secretary, and she was last seen alive entering the murder castle in December of 1892. Her family reported her missing, and Holmes initially claimed that she had simply moved away, but the police grew suspicious.
So her disappearance really started to unravel his carefully constructed facade.
Yeah, it was like pulling a loose thread on a sweater and watching the whole thing start to unravel.
Yeah, and then there were the Williams sisters, Minnie and Anna.
Right, so Holmes seduced Minnie and even convinced her to transfer ownership of her inheritance, which was a valuable piece of property in Texas, to him. And later, both Minnie and her sister Anna vanished without a trace.
It's like he was systematically stripping these women of everything.
He was.
Their possessions, their trust, and ultimately their lives.
Yeah, it's hard to comprehend the level of cruelty involved.
And his methods of killing, they were varied, right? And often quite brutal.
Yeah, he used chloroform to subdue his victims, gas to asphyxiate them, and there's even evidence that suggests that some may have been starved or even burned alive.
Okay, hold on. This is heavy stuff. It's one thing to read about these crimes in the abstract,
Yeah.
but to hear the details and to imagine the terror that these women must have experienced, it's just overwhelming.
Yeah, it's crucial to acknowledge the human cost of Holmes's actions.
Yeah.
These weren't just numbers on a page. They were individuals with lives, families, dreams that were brutally cut short.
And I think, the story of the Petitzel family is perhaps the most devastating of all. It really shows how Holmes was willing to betray even those closest to him, all for his own, twisted gain.
Right, so Benjamin Peetzel, he was Holmes's accomplice in an elaborate insurance scam. The plan was to fake Peetzel's death, collect the insurance money, and then split the proceeds.
Okay.
But Holmes, true to form, he had a far more sinister plan in mind.
He wasn't content with just faking a death.
Oh.
He had to take it a step further.
He murdered Peetzel in cold blood.
Wow.
And then, to make matters even worse, he manipulated Peetzel's wife, Carrie, and gained custody of 3 of her 5 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard.
He killed his accomplice and then took his children. What was he planning on doing with them?
It seems like his plan was to use the children as pawns in his ongoing schemes. He traveled with them throughout the United States and Canada, maintaining this charade that Benjamin Peetzel was still alive and in hiding.
So he was dragging these poor kids along on this macabre road trip, living a lie while their father was already dead by his hand.
It's unfathomable.
It is. And tragically, the children's journey ended in the same horrific way as so many of Holmes's other victims.
Right. He murdered Alice and Nellie in Toronto. Their bodies were found in a trunk. They had been asphyxiated with gas.
And what about young Howard?
He met a similar fate in Indianapolis. Holmes murdered him, dismembered his body, and burned the remains in the chimney of a rental house.
It's beyond comprehension, the level of depravity we're talking about here. But I have to ask, how did he get away with this for so long? I mean, we're talking about multiple murders across multiple states, even countries. How was he not caught sooner?
Well, Holmes was cunning, meticulous, incredibly adept at covering his tracks. He used aliases, forged documents. He constantly moved from place to place, making it very difficult for authorities to connect the dots.
So he was like a phantom, drifting through society, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. But surely his luck couldn't last forever, right? How did he finally get caught?
Well, his downfall began with the Peetzel case. The insurance company, they suspected fraud. And they hired a private detective named Frank Geyer to investigate. And Geyer, he was a relentless investigator. And he started to piece together Holmes's movements, tracking him through a series of aliases and false leads.
So it was like a cat and mouse game, with Geyer slowly closing in on Holmes step by step. What was the final straw? What led to his capture?
Geyer tracked Holmes to Boston, where he was arrested in November of 1894.
Okay, but it wasn't for murder. He was initially arrested for horse theft.
Horse theft. Of all things, it seems almost absurd, considering the scope of his other crimes.
He does, right?
Yeah.
But it was that seemingly minor offense that finally brought him down. So while he was in custody for this horse theft, the authorities started connecting him to the Peetzel murders.
So it was a combination of Geyer's, dogged determination and a little bit of bad luck on Holmes's part. That finally led to his capture.
Yeah, it's almost poetic justice.
It is.
That this man who had evaded justice for so long was brought down by something as, mundane as horse theft.
Exactly. And with Holmes finally behind bars, the full scope of his crimes started to come to light.
Yeah.
He was extradited to Philadelphia to stand trial for the murder of Benjamin Peetzel. What about the murder castle? Did they find any physical evidence to support the accusations against him? Well, the murder castle was thoroughly searched. But a lot of the evidence was circumstantial, so they found a piece of human bone that might have belonged to Julia Connor, some child remains that were possibly pearls, a burned watch chain and dress buttons believed to have belonged to Minnie Williams. They even found a tuft of human hair lodged in a chimney flue.
It's like a macabre jigsaw puzzle, with investigators trying to piece together these fragments. A bone, hair, personal belongings.
Yeah.
To tell the story of what happened within those walls.
Exactly. And while the evidence found at the murder castle wasn't enough to convict him in Chicago, the charges related to the murder of Benjamin Peetzel in Philadelphia, those were much stronger.
So the trial focused on the Peetzel case, where they had the most concrete evidence. What happened during the trial? I mean, did Holmes maintain his composure, or did the mask finally slip?
Even facing the death penalty, Holmes remained remarkably calm and collected. He tried to charm the jury, spinning these elaborate tales, denying any involvement in the murders. But the evidence was overwhelming. The witness testimonies, Geyer's meticulous investigation, it was all there.
So despite his best efforts to, manipulate and deceive, the truth finally caught up with him.
It did. And in October of 1895, Holmes was found guilty of Benjamin Peetzel's murder, and he was sentenced to death. And even as the judge read out the sentence, Holmes remained strangely detached, almost like he couldn't comprehend the gravity of the situation.
Like he had built up this wall of denial,
Yeah.
refusing to acknowledge the consequences of his actions.
Right, and that denial continued even as he awaited his execution. In fact, while he was on death row, he was offered a large sum of money by the Hearst newspapers in exchange for a full confession.
Talk about profiting from your crimes, right? Did he take the deal?
He did confess, but his confession was a calculated mix of truth and fabrication. He admitted to 27 murders and 6 attempted murders, claiming to have killed victims in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto.
But we know that the true number of victims may be much higher. So even in his confession, he was still playing games trying to control the narrative.
Exactly, and perhaps most disturbingly, he showed little to no remorse for his actions. He even boasted about how much his appearance had changed since being imprisoned, almost like he was relishing in the notoriety.
It's like he saw himself as the star of this macabre spectacle, completely detached from the human suffering that he had caused. So how did he face his execution? Did he finally crack? Show any fear or regret?
On May 7, 1896, at Moya Mensing Prison in Philadelphia, H. Holmes was hanged for the murder of Benjamin Pittisell, and according to witnesses, he remained eerily calm and composed throughout the entire ordeal. No tears, no apologies, no desperate pleas for mercy. He simply accepted his fate with a chilling stoicism.
It's like he was performing right up until the very end, playing the role of the unflappable villain.
It certainly adds to the mystique surrounding him.
It does.
Even in death. He refused to let go of this carefully constructed persona that he had created. But there is one last detail about his execution that I find particularly fascinating.
Okay, lay it on me. What is it?
Holmes requested that his coffin be encased in concrete and buried 10 feet deep.
Wow. That's a strange request. Why would he want that?
He claimed to be afraid of grave robbers. He said he was convinced that they would steal his body and use it for dissection.
That's ironic, considering he had no qualms about stealing and dissecting bodies himself.
It is, isn't it? It's almost as if he was projecting his own morbid tendencies onto others, even in death. And, his fear of grave robbers wasn't entirely unfounded. In the late 19th century, the demand for cadavers for medical schools and research was high, and grave robbing was a fairly common practice.
So he was aware of this, dark side of the medical profession, and perhaps he feared that he would become a victim of the very system that he had exploited.
It's a strange twist of fate.
It is.
And it adds another layer of complexity to this already fascinating and disturbing case. But even though Holmes is long gone, the shadow of his crimes and the legend of the murder pestle continue to haunt our collective imagination.
It's like his story has become this cautionary tale, reminding us that beneath the veneer of civilization, darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places.
Absolutely. And his case raises so many questions about the nature of evil, the allure of deception, and the dark side of human ambition. But before we get too philosophical, there are a few more details about the aftermath of Holmes's execution that I think are worth mentioning.
Okay, I'm all ears. What happened to the murder castle itself? And what about the people who were caught up in his web of deceit? Were they ever able to find peace?
Well, shortly after Holmes was arrested, the building was damaged in a fire, but it was actually rebuilt. And it was used as a post office until 1938.
A post office, really? That's almost more unsettling than if they had just torn it down.
I know, right?
It's like they were trying to, ignore the darkness.
Right.
Just pave over it with everyday life.
Just trying to move on.
Yeah. But eventually it was demolished, right?
Yeah, in 1938, the murder castle was finally demolished.
I guess even a building with that much dark history can't escape the wrecking ball forever.
But what about the people who were, connected to Holmes? Did any of them find, any measure of peace after this whole ordeal?
Sadly, not all of them. Remember Marion Hedgepeth? The inmate who gave information about Holmes's insurance scam to the police?
Yeah, the guy who Holmes confided in while he was in jail.
Right, he was pardoned for his cooperation. But his life took a tragic turn. He was shot and killed during a robbery in Chicago a few years later.
It's like the shadow of Holmes's crimes just continued to loom over everyone involved.
It's it's a dark cloud that followed them.
Even those who tried to do the right thing.
Exactly.
And then there's the story of Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the murder castle.
Oh, right.
He committed suicide years later.
Yeah.
Driven, according to his family, by the haunting memories of the building.
And the horrors that he had witnessed.
It's like the place itself was cursed.
Right.
I
mean, it's a breeding ground for tragedy and despair.
Yeah, there's a certain poetic justice in that, don't you think? The man who built a house of horrors, where innocence was extinguished, ultimately became a victim of his own creation.
It's a chilling reminder that the consequences of our actions can ripple outwards,
They do.
affecting not only ourselves, but those around us, sometimes for generations to come. Now, we've talked a lot about the victims, the investigators, the impact of the murder castle.
Hmm.
But I'm kind of curious about another aspect of Holmes's life that we haven't really touched on yet. His personal relationships. I mean, for someone who was so adept at deception and manipulation, it seems like he also had this desire for, like, a seemingly normal family life.
It is one of the most intriguing contradictions in his character. I mean, Holmes was married 3 times, although his first marriage was never officially dissolved. He married his second wife, Murda, while still legally married to Clara. And then he married Georgiana Yoke while still married to both Clara and Murda.
So he was a bigamist on top of everything else. This guy just disregarded every societal rule and expectation.
He really did. He operated outside the bounds of conventional morality, driven by his own twisted set of principles.
But the fact that he went through the motions of marriage multiple times, it suggests that there's a deeper psychological need at play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it was all about control, maintaining this facade of normalcy, like these seemingly legitimate relationships, as a way to, like, mask his darker impulses.
That's a very astute observation. It's possible that marriage, for Holmes, was just another tool in his arsenal of manipulation, a way to gain access to resources, social standing, or even potential victims.
And he even had a daughter with his second wife, Murda.
Right.
Can you imagine what it must have been like for her, growing up with the knowledge that your father was one of America's most notorious serial killers?
It's a horrifying thought, and it speaks to the profound and lasting impact of Holmes's crimes. His actions didn't just end lives, they shattered families. And they left behind a legacy of pain and trauma that reverberated for generations.
I read that his daughter, Lucy, later became a public school teacher.
Wow.
And it makes you wonder, how was she able to, like, reconcile her father's horrific deeds with her own desire to, like, nurture and educate young minds?
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to find hope and meaning even in the face of unimaginable darkness. But it also raises questions about the burden of inheritance, both genetic and social, and the ways in which the sins of the father can cast a long shadow over the lives of their children.
This deep dive has been a roller coaster, I gotta say.
It has.
Horror, fascination, disgust, even pity at times. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the story of H.H. Holmes is more than just a true crime tale. It's a reflection of the complexities of human nature, the seductive allure of darkness, and the enduring struggle between good and evil.
I couldn't agree more. Holmes's story, as gruesome and unsettling as it is, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the society we live in. It reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, cloaked in charm, ambition, and a perverse sense of entitlement.
And it reminds us that we must always be vigilant, right?
Yes.
Questioning appearances, challenging those who seek to exploit the vulnerable for their own gains. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and crimes of H.H. Holmes, I'm left with one final lingering question. Why are we so drawn to these stories of darkness and depravity? What is it about figures like Holmes that continues to fascinate us, even over a century later?
That's a great question. Maybe it's a way of confronting our own mortality, our own capacity for both good and evil. By peering into the abyss, we hope to gain a better understanding of ourselves, of the forces that shape our world, and of the choices we make each and every day.
Or maybe it's just morbid curiosity, a desire to, like, glimpse the forbidden, to explore the dark underbelly of human nature, whatever the reason. The story of H.H. Holmes continues to captivate our imaginations. It serves as a cautionary tale, a source of endless fascination, and a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is often thinner than we'd like to believe.
Well said. And on that thought-provoking note, I think it's time to close the book on this particular deep dive. But the conversation doesn't have to end here, right?
Of course not.
I encourage you to explore sources we've discussed, delve deeper into the historical context, and maybe even challenge your own assumptions about the nature of good and evil.
Yeah. This deep dive was just a starting point, a glimpse into the dark and twisted world of H.H. Holmes. And who knows, maybe you'll uncover something that we missed. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, but remember, be careful out there. The world can be a strange and unsettling place.